We are extremely lucky to have three outstanding veteran journalists here with us: John Walcott, Warren Strobel, and Jonathan Landay. They were a team of John Walcott as the editor and Warren and Jonathan as reporters at Knight Ridder in the early 2000s during the run-up to the Iraq War. They did some fabulous reporting at the time, and as evidenced by the fact that they were virtually alone on the story about whether Saddam Hussein actually had weapons of mass destruction. Most of the rest of the media was taking the Bush administration's positions and stances verbatim and putting them in the paper. Warren and John were calling into question the evidence that they were putting up there. It was kind of groundbreaking reporting, as evidenced by the fact that over the next couple of years, there were a handful of stories done in journalism organizations kind of saying, you know, why these guys get it right when everybody else got it wrong. So the Neiman Watchdog Special Polls for Knight Ridder's pre-war coverage, New York Review of Books, Now They Tell Us, Harper's Magazine, No Reward for Being Right on Iraq, Neiman Reports, another discussion. All of these were talked about the work that they did and contrasted it with the work that others were doing. 15 years after the fact of that reporting, this is now being featured in a movie directed by Rob Reiner that is coming out later in the year, and they'll tell you about that. But this is the IMDb page. IMDb, my favorite non-news organization website. Jonathan is being played by Woody Harrelson. Warren being played by James Marsden. Joe Galloway, who's not here with us, but he was another key member of the team. He's being played by Tommy Lee Jones. And John Walcott is being played by Rob Reiner. So they're going to tell you about the reporting, tell you what the arc of the story was, because we, us graybeards here, kind of realize that for some of you, this is the history book stuff. And then they're going to tell you how the reporting came about, and then tell you a little bit about the movie, which was filmed during the spring and is now, I guess, in post-production or somewhere along the process. So I'm going to turn it over to John Walcott.
Thank you, and thank you for reminding me that this is history. The last thing I need to be reminded of. Anyway, real quickly, for those of you who were in kindergarten at the time, the story actually began in the 1990s as worries in the intelligence community about al-Qaeda and bin Laden began to grow. But no one paid much attention to that until 9/11. I've now compressed about 6 years. 9/11 happens. And immediately, it's clear that this is al-Qaeda. There's no question. And secondly, al-Qaeda has safe haven in Afghanistan. So the focus immediately is on Afghanistan. But Warren will talk more about this in the reporting we did, but by the fall of 2001, it was clear that the administration also had its eyes on Iraq, which had nothing to do with the 9/11 attack. But it was clear by then. And starting early in 2001, they began building a case against Iraq, the focal points of which were that Iraq somehow was connected to al-Qaeda, and second, that it had hidden weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, nuclear weapons, and that therefore it posed a threat to the United States and its allies, starting with Israel, also Saudi Arabia, and had to be taken out. And the first story we wrote saying that the administration had made that decision was mid-February of 2002. So by then it was clear to us what their objective was. And as Chris alluded to, the administration kept making a case that they had hidden WMD and that, this guy posed a grave threat to the United States and its allies. And some of that case you may remember. I'll let the other two talk in a little more detail about the aluminum tubes chapter of that. My own personal favorite was that Saddam had bioweapons labs hidden in milk and yogurt trucks, which is one of the many things that made us a little skeptical of the case the administration was making for war. Anyway, March 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, having mustered a bunch of allies. And I think we're catching up with what you actually remember. That has not gone well. And we're now facing the last of the battle for Mosul. And finally, and I'll end with this, because I really would much rather take questions than talk at you. The question now is, what happens as what's left of al-Qaeda continues to metastasize, and as ISIS does the same thing? Now, you've seen the answer to that question in Britain, in Manchester, and now again in London. Different brand of terrorism. This is not guys trained to be pilots. They have driver's licenses. And they're not carrying biological and chemical weapons. They're carrying knives. And so for all the effort and the lives that were expended, American and other, including some reporters, one of our translators and his son, I think, got too close to an American convoy, were killed. And then we had to make a hell of an effort that included the Secretary of State to get his widow into the United States. And that problem continues, getting Terps in here. So here we are 16 years later, and the problem's still with us, and in some ways it's metastasized into something more difficult to deal with than an al-Qaeda that was concentrated in camps around Kandahar and had a military headquarters in Kabul. So that's the arc of the story. I'll let Warren talk some about how we reported all that.
Thank you for having us today. I'm going to be real brief, too, because I think it would be much more useful for us to have an interchange than for us to sit up here and just talk. So I've had 15 years to think about why my colleagues who are sitting here and others of us at Knight Ridder were able to cover this story differently than virtually every other, well, really every other American news outlet. I think one thing is, like, and this may be an important lesson for everyone at the table, is time on the beat. By the time 9/11 happened, I think John and Joe Galloway and I had combined maybe 100 years.
Only 82.
82. It's more than that now, of covering national security and foreign policy, both in Washington and overseas. John and John spent extensive time in war zones. I've done some of that myself. We'd all been in the Arab world. We had deep sources in Washington. And when the administration started talking about Saddam Hussein being tied in with bin Laden and al-Qaeda, it just did not make any sense whatsoever. And it's often forgotten. The shorthand now is that we went to war over Iraq WMDs, but in fact, the case for war was that Saddam has WMDs. We can't wait because maybe he'll give them to a terrorist group and they'll attack us like we were attacked on 9/11. That was the argument. So I think the time on the beat was important. The fact that we worked as a team was really, really important. And, you know, there's 4 of us in the movie, but it was really a larger team of reporters and editors who we should also get credit. We shared sources. We were open with each other about what we were reporting, who we were talking to. We had different strengths and weaknesses. This is kind of an oversimplification, but John Landay focused a lot on the WMD file, looking in great detail at the case they were making for Saddam's proliferation, looking in great detail at the October 2002 National Intelligence Estimate. I tended to focus more on the terrorism file. Again, we overlapped extensively, but I think the fact that we worked together, we had the experience, we worked together, and thirdly, and most importantly, is that we worked sources that were not at the very top. We did have some sources in high levels, but most of the top people in the Bush administration were whispering on the phone to people like Judy Miller at the New York Times and other reporters, and just sort of echoing the administration or pushing the administration line. We consciously worked the mid-levels of the intelligence agencies, the U.S. military, and the State Department, where you have, I hope we still have people like this there, fewer and fewer every day, but you have career people who are specialists, they're nonpartisan, they care about the truth, and more as time went by and they saw what the administration was doing, they spoke to us, and we reached out to them, and as we wrote more stories, more of them would reach back to us. And I think this was a key point that, especially in Washington, and John has made this point over and over again, it's very tempting to say that I have some high source in the White House who's close to the president. In the end of the day, that actually doesn't get you much closer to the truth. digging into the bureaucracy where people aren't looking to get you close to the truth. And I'll just finish up by saying there's two other things that, again, John was our editor and was sort of the, prime mover is not quite the right word, but he sort of set the tone of the direction. And he told us two things that I'll never forget. One is, if the government says something, your only job is to ask whether it's true. And secondly, at Knight Ridder, we had 30 papers around the country, many of them serving bases in cities where U.S. military and their families were stationed. And John often told us, we don't write for the people who send other people's kids off to war. We write for the people whose kids get sent off to war. And if you go see the movie, those lines might sound kind of familiar. In all seriousness, fact-checking the government, which is what journalists should do every day, but I think a lot of our colleagues the other news media forgot that in the afternoon for 9/11. And secondly, remember who you're writing for. So, over to you.
Okay. So in 2012 or 13, 13, I think, I was on my way back from a visit to the Middle East, Egypt, and then I got sent to Jordan to cover the President Obama's non-red line on Syria's use of chemical weapons. And I was watching a movie coming into across the Atlantic, in which The Wolf of Wall Street it was called, and it just finished as we were landing at Dulles, and this guy Rob Reiner was in this movie playing an accountant, a crooked accountant, Leon DiCaprio's father. And we touched down, and I turned my cell phone on, and there's an email from him that says, "You won't believe who I just got off the phone with. Rob Reiner, aka Meathead, wants to write a movie about us." And he had been copied, and he said, he had been copied. He said, "Well, I just spoke to him for an hour yesterday." And then the following day, Rob calls me, and we're on the phone for 45 minutes. I mean, we were never. We didn't win any Pulitzers for the work we did, but I think this is probably better than a Pulitzer. We were intricately involved in the making of this movie. We helped write and rewrite the script. We were on set as consultants to make sure that things didn't. It's not obviously it's a based on movie, so it's not absolutely it's not a documentary, and it takes some of the things we did and compresses the time in which we did it, so to be able to make key points. But the fact is that this is a movie for today, and it's more pertinent now than ever before, given the assault on responsible journalism led by the President of the United States. It's about what real journalism is, and as Warren said, our guideposts for whatever the government tells you, is it true? And we went out with that in mind. Let me get back to the movie, since that's what I'm supposed to be talking about. We filmed virtually the entire thing in New Orleans because they have had fairly good laws that favored movie makers. It was amazing to watch because there's a lot. So it's the first time. There's two stories here. It's ours plus. It follows the story of a young man who signs up for the military after 9/11, and for the first time, Rob said he's actually putting an explosion in one of his movies. Rob is very, very attentive to the truth. In fact, he told us that whenever he makes a movie based on real events, he tries to get as close to the truth as possible. Whether that is Ghosts of Mississippi, A Few Good Men, which was based on a real incident at Guantanamo, although compressed the number of people who were involved. And that's why he brought us in. It was an incredible experience, and I think, as I said, it's a movie for our time, because it actually shows what we did as journalists and how we did it, and our thought processes, and the extent to which we would go to confirm the things that we were hearing, all of which is not so, there's a lot of problems in the industry today, and particularly with the use of social media and this and the pressure on journalists to file first, to get that tweet out before anyone else does, to get that quote out, even if it's not in context. And I think that this movie has a lot of lessons to teach in that regard.
Okay, bring it on.
You're on.
Your turn. Start wherever you want.
What kind of reaction were you guys getting from other journalists when you were reporting, on WMDs, sort of counter to this story coming from a lot of other organizations?
Even though they weren't really doing what we were doing, I at the time was a Pentagon reporter for Knight Ridder. And I remember one time after, I forget which story it was, going into a briefing at the Pentagon and a journalist coming up to me and patting me on the back saying, "Way to go, keep doing this." And I'm thinking to myself, well, why aren't you doing the same thing? We were largely ignored, as a matter of fact, and in particular by the government, particularly by the White House, because it would have been the best advertising we could have asked for our stories. Not only that, some of our own newspapers, major Knight Ridder newspapers, weren't running our stories. They would ignore our stories. Why? Well, we haven't seen it in the New York Times or the Washington Post. And so it was kind of lonely out there, very lonely out there. And as you'll see in the movie, there were times when Warren and I would look at each other going, "Are we right? Are we right?" And I would go home and have sleepless nights, literally, about this, because no one else was reporting. I know you were, but no one else was reporting what we were reporting. And I think it's really heartening right now to see the news organizations hot on the Trump-Russia story. It's become it's highly competitive. But it's a good thing that you have multiple news organizations now who are devoting extensive resources, including Reuters. John is running the team that Warren and I are part of that are involved in this investigation, and we've actually broken a number of major stories. As opposed to what happened after 9/11, it's no longer lonely, it's highly competitive, but that's a good thing.
What kind of pushback were you getting from the administration at the time? Like privately, I guess.
It's cool.
A good deal. We were accused of treason. I had a rather heated conversation with a very senior member of the administration about that. So there was a lot of pushback. Some of it was directed at us, and I can't let this occasion go by, especially since we're doing Facebook Live. We could not have done any of this without the support of my boss, Clark Hoyt, the Washington editor at the time, and Tony Ritter, the CEO of Knight Ridder. I only found out long after the fact that a number of advertisers had gone to Tony and said, "Please warn us when you're going to run one of these unpatriotic stories so we can pull our ads." And Tony's response every time was, "You'll see the story the same time I do when it's in the paper." And without that, none of this would have happened. So there was pushback from the administration, but more important in the industry, there was pushback from advertisers. And you can't let the advertisers run the news organization. And it's harder today than it was in 2001 and 2002, given the financial foundation of the industry. But shout out to Clark and to Tony about that. In terms of administration pushback, that was easy to deal with. We're not stenographers. We're journalists. And you all know what the difference is.
Have you had conversations with any of the Bush administration in the sense where handshake, let's talk about it, yeah, you guys were right. I mean, is there anything follow-up with?
Well, there were a lot of people in the administration whose names we're not going to disclose who are with us all the way. And that's another, John alluded to this, but we're seeing the same kind of thing today, where there are a lot of people in the government who really don't have fights to pick with the mayor of London. and who really think the Paris Accord was probably a good thing. And that goes to the heart of what John said and the heart of what we did, which is, we'll hear this in the movie too, but you know, the value of a source is not directly proportional to their rank. The relationship is more often inverse. And we're seeing that again today, and we sure as heck saw it when we were doing this reporting.
When it comes to the sources, more you mentioned it too at the mid-level, how did you kind of distinguish between people who were actually giving you something you could really use and people who were bullshit?
That's a good question. I think part of it is if they worked directly for Bush in a political sense, then we sort of knew that they were going to support the administration line. Doesn't mean, of course, that you completely ignore what they say. But again, in the bureaucracy, there are people who serve administration to administration. They are nonpartisan. And a lot of it is like some of these people can't identify them. There were people we knew already for him. So those relationships that you all are building and will build throughout your careers are just incredibly invaluable. And the other thing is sort of success builds on success. So in the summer of 2001, I had gone to the Sudan for 9/11 on a trip that boss man here approved. And I came back and I went to the, this is called the Freedom Forum at the time, in Northern Virginia, and we was on a panel talking about North Sudan, South Sudan. And I mention this because like 3 months later we did one of our stories, and a woman, Air Force officer, happened to be in the audience that day, had worked in the Africa division of the policy shop at Pentagon. She had transferred to the Middle East shop. And she remembered me, she saw our story, and she reached out to us and became, and her role's kind of public now, she became a great source. So I think it's, it's a combination of trust, verification, and long-term relationships. And John, you got something to add?
Yeah, I mean, and let's not forget the two-source rule. I mean, and the good thing was that we had each cultivated sources. You heard that in Washington a long time. We had different sources. So Warren would hear something from one of his sources and would tell me, and I would go out to someone in a different building, a different person in a different building, and if I heard the same thing, well, we had our two sources. And generally, we'd have more than two sources. So that was a really important part of ensuring that what we had was actually accurate. Yeah, and it served us well. Now, there was only one time when we got a story wrong, and that's because I was misled by someone in the government, in the intelligence community, who will remain nameless, about the origin of a source named Curveball, who was a source who turned up as a refugee, an Iraqi refugee in Germany, and claimed to have known all of this different information about Saddam's alleged weapons programs, and it turned out that it was just making all of it up in order to facilitate his a permission to stay in Germany. And this was sussed out by someone in the intelligence community who went over there, I believe, on vacation, because he couldn't get permission to go officially, a senior person. I was told that, what I was told was that Curveball was a source who had been put up to what he said by a man by the name of Ahmed Chalabi, who's no longer with us. He was the head of the Iraqi National Congress, which was the leading Iraqi dissident group, and was responsible for planting a lot of the fake information that was used by they planted fake information with the administration, and then would plant the same information with select journalists, and so there would be this circular confirmation in public. I was told that he was a Chalabi source. It turned out that he wasn't, and I put it into a story that I misreported this. But beyond that, we didn't have to retract anything or correct anything that we reported.
Where do you see parallels today, like where people are kind of just blindly following the narrative? Where do you see parallels today where reporters are blindly following a narrative and you kind of wish that they would be going a different direction? It's intentionally vague, so.
Yeah, let me start on that real quickly. I don't see, I actually think because Trump came out so quickly and challenged the media and called them enemies of the people that there's been, it has served to stiffen the spine generally of mainstream news media organizations, which is good. Most. So I don't really see a parallel there where people are just following a narrative. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, I think, the media today, just look around at your name tags, it's far more diverse than it was in 2001. And there are news organizations, Fox News, Breitbart, that are carrying water for the administration. And will follow his lead when he tries to change the subject. And you'll see more of it this week as he tries to change the subject away from Jim Comey's testimony on Thursday, which is damaging. But in the main, the number of news organizations that are challenging the administration on this is huge multiple of what we saw in 2001. And it includes outfits that didn't exist in 2001. The downside of that, as I think John alluded to, is this press for instant news. And so sometimes things get out with good intentions, but they aren't fully reported. And it is really hard to keep your foot on the brake pedal in this environment. Really hard. You all know that.
I think where the parallel exists, and this is what I was going to say before it slipped my mind, is you again have 15 years later have the president trying to basically construct an alternate reality that is based on non-empirically verified information. And if we, the media, we the American people, allow our leaders to do that, we're in a whole lot of trouble. As famous philosophers have pointed out, and that there is a parallel. And I think, as John said, the media is doing better this time, generally.
I think John made the point that I was going to make, which is there's a whole slew of organizations out there that are carrying the administration's water and talking points. And so when most of us are focused on potential or the possible collusion between the Trump campaign, and Russia and various aspects of that, you have other organizations which are heaving to the White House GOP line, which is we have to uncover these leaks of highly classified information to the media, even though certain organizations that have been leading the charge on that use leaks of highly classified information from their sources all the time. And they're the same ones who are sort of focusing on the need for an investigation into leaks.
I'm curious what you would say is the core reason for the Iraq invasion and whether the individual reflects the same.
It's a great question because I don't think
We get asked all the time.
We get asked it all the time. Rob asked it.
Tommy Lee Jones
asked it. Woody Harrelson
Woody asked it.
Woody asked it.
What was our question?
And
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Why did we invade Iraq?
why did we invade Iraq?
Okay.
Was the question. And I think there were multiple motives. Is my best answer. In some cases, it was about defending Israel, with the belief that Iraq posed a threat to Israel. And so for some people it was that. I think for some people it may have had a little bit to do with oil, but Trump notwithstanding, I don't think seizing Iraqi oil was really the motive here. I think there were some people who believed, and this may be somewhere at the core of it, or it may be a rationalization, I don't know, that if you planted a palm tree of democracy in the middle of the Iraqi desert, it would somehow grow and spread across the Middle East and eliminate the instability in that region and pose a threat not just to Israel, but more broadly. And there were a number of people, including the Undersecretary of Defense, who believed that. And we always thought that was naive, having spent a fair amount of time in that part of the world. But it's also rooted in, I think, classic American exceptionalism. The belief that really everybody in the world wants to be like us, and they want to be governed the way we are. And you're seeing that in this administration. You know, anybody who does not want to be like us is a potential enemy. And if they don't worship the way we do, if they don't look the way we do, if they don't talk the way we do, then we got to be careful and watch out for them, and maybe even keep them out of the country. The converse of that was they all want to be like us, so all we have to do is invade them, plant the flag, and they'll all rally around. And then there were some people for whom the agent of that was Ahmed Chalabi. And he conned everybody who believed in this cause into thinking that that is what his intention was, despite the fact that he had a conviction for bank fraud in Jordan. And I distinctly remember, I think you'll see this in the movie too, the first time I met Chalabi was in 1996, I think, at a townhouse that he owned facing the Georgetown campus, right behind the nursing school building, St. Mary's Hall. And I walked out, I went over there with David Mark from CBS, who's a very close friend and with whom I wrote a book many years ago on 1980s terrorism. And as I walked out, I turned to David and said, if that guy gave me change for a quarter, I'd count it. He was just so transparently a crook. But I think he told people what they wanted to hear, and that was all it took.
I think there are a couple of other reasons. And it depends who you're talking about. Each sort of part of the neocon establishment within and without the White House had its own reasons. I think both Cheney and Rumsfeld were all about, well, we've invaded Afghanistan, but it's just a pile of rocks and there's nothing there to bomb, and really deliver a message that nobody will do this to the United States, no matter who it was. I mean, I think they felt that they needed to go out and demonstrate the United States will not sit by and allow 9/11 to happen.
Cheney and Rumsfeld, and I'll tell you an anecdote about that from my friend Joe Galloway. I had sent Joe to cover the Gulf War in '91, and he called me on the tactical satellite, TACSAT, from the 24th Infantry Division, which he was embedded with in an onion field outside Basra. And as we were talking, there was suddenly an explosion of voices in the background that I can't repeat on Facebook Live, but suffice it to say they were unhappy soldiers who were questioning why they'd been ordered to stand down. They had 2 Republican Guard divisions, as they say in the military, dialed in with their artillery and their multiple launch rocket systems, and they were ordered to stand down. The war was over. And within 2 weeks, there were photos started appearing of Iraqi Shiites dangling hung from the barrels of those very tanks. And I think that weighed heavily on a lot of people's minds. We should have finished the job. This is our chance.
So to sum it up, we actually don't know why.
No idea.
You mentioned,
She's been trying.
thank you. I have. You mentioned the sleepless nights that come along with this. I'm wondering if you can talk specifically for our own reporting about a roadblock that you might have run into, and then how, from a practical standpoint, you plowed through it, and then also like the mental and emotional side, how you overcome the frustration and the fatigue that can sometimes set in when you're chasing something.
While they're thinking of roadblocks,
We got a lot of them right now.
I'm the only one who didn't have sleepless nights over this. And there's a scene in the movie you'll see in which I'm asked, aren't you concerned? No one else is reporting this. And my answer today is the same as my answer was then. I know who their sources are, and I know who our sources are. That goes back to the central point I think we're trying to make, which is dig into these bureaucracies, deal with people over a period of time, and figure out who you can trust and who you can't. And it takes time, and it takes effort, and it takes a lot of time away from the office. You can't do that on the phone, you can't do it on email. You got to do it face-to-face in a lot of cases. Certainly when you're dealing with national security information, or you're dealing with information that has corporate or financial importance. Just have to go out and meet people and decide, I can trust this one, that one is playing games with me.
So I think it comes back to that. You trust your sources and people you know and trust. I mean, I didn't have like sleepless nights, but we in the media, we love to be ahead of the pack, right? But we don't like to be here when the pack is there. That's just the truth. I mean, sometimes it's very uncomfortable. What we were reporting was so different that to have a report every day, to pick up all the other media, all the TV stations, what the administrators were saying, and see something different. And then our own newspapers weren't often publishing it because it was not what Judy Miller, New York Times, was saying. My colleagues didn't mention this, but we actually had one, I think I can say this on Facebook Live, one of the newspapers, which we'll go and mention, actually commissioned an effort to go do their own investigation and prove us wrong. One of our own neighborhood newspapers. So, yeah, they were that sure that we were wrong, and
How'd that go?
the New York Times.
Not well.
Well for them.
You'll see that in the movie as well.
So it's an uneasy feeling. Yeah, of course, we all like to do exclusive stuff and be there first, but sometimes, and there are scenes in the movie, both you and I, where it's a little bit unsettling to be not ahead of the pack, but in a different place.
No specific roadblock comes to mind over those stories. Right now, there are considerable roadblocks, and I've been spending a lot of time knocking on people's doors. And you got to do that. You got to wear down the leather on the bottom of your shoes. You got to, and it's not often pleasant when somebody comes to the door and says, "What the hell are you doing, coming to my home?" But on the other hand, it can also lead to the best leads you can pick up, and the best information you can get, because 10 of those, you might get a door slammed in your face 4 or 5 times, but that 6th time, is gold. Back then, I think I don't remember having major problems confirming stuff. It takes a while, and you just have to stick with it. When you know you're right, when you trust the original source, then you just power ahead and you go to everyone else that you can think of who might have an idea, or might know somebody who might have an idea of what you're chasing, and that's it. I was part of a team at McClatchy, which was the successor to Knight Ridder. We broke the story on the CIA monitoring of the Senate Intelligence Committee computers that were being used to compose the torture report. At that point, here I was, a senior guy, and one of my teammates was out in the middle of winter in 20-degree weather, knocking on people's doors and putting me to shame. And I ended up joining her on those freezing nights in December and January, knocking on people's doors, waiting I remember one night we were 2 hours waiting outside in 20-degree weather. We were Pulitzer finalists in the end for that. Should have won. But that's what you got to do. A lot of the journalism here in Washington is telephone journalism, as I call it, but some of the most rewarding journalism is getting out and knocking on doors.
I think rather than roadblocks, one way to think about how the journalism progressed for us is pivot points. And I think this would be true when, or maybe you already have, but as you go through like a long-term, multi-year investigation, it's important to know recognize the pivot points when they happen, and play off them. One pivot point was early on when I got a phone call and somebody told me that James Woolsey, the former director of the CIA, was on a plane that was arranged by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz. He was going to Wales to try, and stick with me here, he was going to try and prove this crazy theory that Saddam had actually been behind the first attempt to take down the World Trade Towers and the bombing in 1993. And once that happened, I'm like, wow, they're trying to link Saddam to 1993 and to 9/11, and the Deputy Secretary of Defense is sponsoring this effort. What the hell's going on here? Another pivot point comes when you, John, get a call from somebody in the field saying, where the hell are my, I think they use even rougher language than that, but where are my assets? And this person,
was in Afghanistan.
Before the war, they were already moving intelligence, linguistic, and other language capabilities, intelligence assets, other assets to be positioned for Iraq. Another pivot point comes when John, it was shortly after Vice President Dick Cheney makes a speech in which he says, many of us believe that fairly soon Saddam will have nuclear weapons. I'm paraphrasing. And that's pretty good. And then
we started making
you
calls,
and
I called the source, and I said, "What's this all about? This is new." And the source said to me, "The vice president is lying," and that's in the movie.
yeah.
And that we knew. I went running into them. I grabbed him and I said, "Come in with me." And we knew that's when we were off to the races.
And one other pivot point I'll mention real briefly is within, I think you may have been in Afghanistan at this point. I think you were. When John went to Afghanistan to cover the war there, the Battle of Tora Bora, where they missed bin Laden. But within 2 or 3 days, or most a week, John and I both hear that they basically made a decision. Saddam has to go. They haven't decided how or when or what. And this is January. The article was up there earlier, February 2002. That was long before anybody was reporting that they were going to take out Saddam or a decision to do. And so when, again, good sources, coordinating, working together, we hear that, and bam.
The first pivot point actually was September 12th, when Warren came back from covering an NSC meeting and said they were talking about Iraq. And I thought, why in God's name are they talking about Iraq? It had nothing to do with terrorism, and back in my memory, which is sort of the importance of covering things over a long period of time, I remembered when the Palestinian terrorist Abu Nidal, who caused all kinds of trouble in the 1980s, was forced to move from Libya to Iraq. That was the end of it as a terrorist. Saddam Hussein sat on it. No more Rome and Vienna airport massacres, no more of his tricks. It made no sense. It failed the logic test. And an awful lot of what was said failed basic logic test, and that's what gets your nose twitching. Chalabi saying he's going to reopen an oil pipeline to Haifa. From Iraq. Yeah, right. So that's where there are a lot of pivot points you don't necessarily recognize. I'll give you a current example. Watch very closely how that mid-level of the bureaucracy reacts to the last 3 days of Trump tweets and the climate change decision. Taking on his own Justice Department, saying he's going to privatize the FAA, attacking the mayor of London. The U.S. chargé in London's already contradicted that one. Congratulated the mayor, Sadiq Khan. Little things like that you need to pay attention to, because very often they turn out to be the pivot points. And you don't realize it until later, but it basically is a red flag that says, pay attention to this. Something has changed. In mathematics, it's called a delta. And that, look for the delta. Look for when something has changed. It can be tone, it can be subject matter, it can be the personnel involved, I mean, any number of things. But that's what you look for, and they often come before a pivot point that you recognize.
I think the biggest pivot point, which we haven't talked about, and I think that comes in the movie, is the idea that a Sunni dictator is in league with a terrorist whose entire goal was to overthrow Sunni dictators in the Middle East. Right? These were his targets. He was, so let me back up, Saddam was Sunni, but really secularist, more than he used religion towards the end, particularly after the defeat in Kuwait, to maintain his grip on power. He resorted to the use of religion. But the idea that an extremist like bin Laden was in league with basically a secular dictator, Arab dictator, just didn't, as John said, it was probably the biggest thing that made no sense to us at all. And to most people, a lot of people, not most people, but a lot of people who watched the region, it just made no sense.
Yeah, I remembered an anecdote from many years before. I had a reporter at U.S. News named Louise Leaf, who's at American University now. Louise speaks fluent Arabic, and I had sent her to Iraq shortly before the 1990 invasion of Kuwait. And we did a cover story at U.S. News in June of 1990 calling Saddam the most dangerous man in the world. But one of the things she had observed, she'd gone out to dinner one night, and there was Saddam's son Uday drinking up a storm and had his bodyguards grab some woman from another table and drag her off with him. This is not the kind of behavior that a bin Laden applauds. drinking itself is haram, is banned. So this guy is the enemy, as John said, of a bin Laden or of a Taliban, not an ally. It just made no sense.
Could you walk us through the process? I think, John, you referenced like a gold mine source, and say you get a big tip during this period, post 9/11 up until the invasion, I guess. How many stories were you churning out? What was the atmosphere like? Because it's not a quick turnaround thing. Obviously, you had great sources. You got to run things down.
It depends on what there were stories that took us a while to put together because we'd have to find the sources who could confirm what we had heard. I think that there was a really difficult story that we put together, basically saying here's what the plan. Here's what the plan was. The plan was to go in, shave off the top layer of the Iraqi bureaucracy and put Mr. Chalabi in charge because he had sold the administration on the idea that he had the whole bureaucracy wired, and that the first American boot that crossed the go line, when that happened, the whole thing would fall apart. At least the top level would, Saddam and his minions would go, and he would come in, sweep in with his people because he had it all wired up. He had generals, he had bureaucrats, he had this and that, and everything would just keep functioning. It wouldn't, it wouldn't go to hell, which is exactly what happened. That, I think, took a lot of sourcing, a lot of digging. On the other hand, I think the story that perhaps, and don't forget, there was no Twitter back then. I don't think there was a Facebook even in 2001. And so there was no way, we didn't have the social media that, you put a story out and it catches fire within 5 minutes, it's trending on Twitter. And I love Twitter because it's a way of really, of distributing, of distributing your stories. But one day I got a call from somebody who said to me, you should compare the declassified version of the 2001 National Intelligence Estimate on Iraq. And does everybody know what a National Intelligence Estimate is? Okay, so it's the highest level intelligence analysis that is done for the President of the United States. Only he and his top aides can read it. It is done by a body called the National Intelligence Council. It's specially ordered up. And usually you have an NIE done. I think members of Congress can read it in the classified reading room, but otherwise it's very, very restricted. And usually an NIE is done before a president makes a decision on something as grave as taking the country to war. In this case, it was the congressional Democrats who were clamoring for an NIE to be done before the invasion because the Bush administration, the Bush White House, never asked for one, and so they wanted an NIE on how serious is the Saddam WMD threat. So they produced the declassified version in October 2002, which I got a great story out of also, because everybody went for the finding, he's got this, he's got that, we think he's got this, we think he's got that, it's possible he's got this. But there were dissents in there that were footnoted from various parts of the intelligence community saying, we disagree with this, we disagree with that. So that's what I focused on when I wrote my story. Someone called me up 6 months later because after the invasion, when no weapons of mass destruction were found, the Bush administration came under pressure to make the classified version of the NIE available, to declassify it and send it out to the public. So someone called me, it's actually about a year later, to say you should compare the declassified version of the NIE and the classified version. So I sat back and I looked at it and I put the two side by side and I went, holy cow. I mean, completely different. The American government, the American people were being told categorically that he had this and he had that and he had bioweapons and he had this, but the classified version had all sorts of caveats in it. It's possible, we assess with low probability, all of that had been cut out of the declassified version. And I wrote a story comparing the two. It took me 2 days, and it probably got more attention than virtually any story we wrote. So it depends what the story is.
Not to ask you guys
in counterfactuals, but on like the Twitter notes, do you feel like if you had been writing stories like this in our current media age, where it's easier to get the word out via Twitter and social media and things like that, you would have had a better chance of influencing the public debate prior to us going to war?
I doubt it, frankly, for two reasons. One is that we were unpatriotic. In the wake of 9/11, there was a surge of support for the administration, predictably. And we were running counter to that. And secondly, I suspect we would have been out-tweeted, plain and simple. You know, if President Bush had had access to Twitter, or Vice President Cheney, or Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, they would have had voices in the Twitter sphere too. And I go back to the basic point, their titles, for whatever reason, gave them a measure of credibility that we didn't have. We weren't the New York Times. We weren't CBS. We weren't ABC. You'll hear that in the movie too. And I think we would still have been at a disadvantage, just as we were with our own newspapers, some of them.
I'm sorry, I don't know if you're about to say. I'm curious, given your sources within national intelligence, the State Department, if you could just broadly characterize how that mid-level or career professionals view the current administration.
Okay, I'll take this.
Deep breath.
It's going to be a broad brush, but I think from what I've heard, directly and indirectly, both within the intelligence community and the U.S. law enforcement community, there's deep, deep concern about some of the things the president says and does. Let me take the National Security Agency, which, as most of you know, is that they do eavesdropping. They're supposed to eavesdrop on foreign targets. When the president or people close to him or people in Fox News who are in the same general sphere as him say that the British were spying on Trump Tower on behalf of Obama, that really disturbs people in the intelligence community who know that that's ridiculous, that it's actually against the rules. There's actually an agreement that not only can we not spy on Americans, we cannot ask the British or the Australians, Canadians, and New Zealanders to do what we're not legally allowed to do. So they see that kind of stuff, and I think they're sort of appalled that it's being repeated or not denied, but then it also, I think, deeply disturbs them in terms of their own role. That's about all I can say.
Yeah, well, the other thing that may be indicative is just factual. I mean, the deputy chief of mission, the charge d'affaires running the embassy in Beijing, one of our most important embassies, just quit today, China time. And so that's something you want to keep your eye on. That, in time, may answer your question better than we can.
I think just by the mere fact, I mean, look at the State Department and just the enormous numbers of vacancies there. I think part of the problem is they can't find people, and I think it goes to, remember we were supposed to have a new FBI director 2 weeks ago. We have no, there are deputies, there are assistant secretaries, undersecretaries in, across the national security bureaucracy who have not been nominated. I think there's, I saw a figure today, was put out by the Democrats, that there are more than 500 confirmable positions, and only, and the president has not, there's 400, I want to get this right, more than 440 have not been nominated. And yet he's out tweeting about how, the Democrats are blocking appointments. The fact is, I think that there's a great deal of dissent and anger growing within the national security bureaucracy. He's been contradicting some of his own cabinet members on what they had to say. You see a report in Politico today about how he just passed over a passage in his speech to NATO that his national security advisor, and I believe the defense secretary, had persuaded him to put in there, reaffirming American commitment to Article 5. Does everybody know what Article 5 is? Article 5 is the heart of the Treaty of Washington, which created NATO, which is an attack on one is considered an attack on all. right? And it's about mutual self-defense. He passed over. So if you're those people, if you're working for them, you're going, what is going on here? Where the President of the United States doesn't, it just defies his own top national security people. And I think you're going to see there, as John mentioned, there were tweets before I left the office that the chargé, the #2 American diplomat in the Beijing embassy, called a town hall of the embassy, called all the embassy together and announced he was resigning because he could not bring himself to deliver a démarche to the Chinese government over the Paris Agreement, staying in the Paris Climate Change Accord. And I think we may be hearing about another high-profile resignation. We're not going to say who yet, but I think you may start seeing this wave of high-level people resigning from the government simply because they can no longer work for this particular president.
Time for like one more quick one. Phil.
So I forget if it was exactly when, but so the UN comes out and says, we did this investigation, there are no weapons of mass destruction. I guess, how do you guys then go back to doing other stories without the administration? Like, are all those people kind of dead to you in some ways? Like, I guess, how do you, what happens next?
No, not at all. I mean, and in fact, it was the U.S. government itself that announced that it found, they had a special team, the Iraq Study Group.
Yeah.
Is that it, or the Iraq?
David Kay?
Yeah, David Kay, who was a former IAEA inspector, went over there, and they went and they determined no, he didn't have these programs, and that he was keeping that fiction alive simply to maintain his grip on power, and we covered the war, we covered the aftermath. I mean, there's always stuff to do in the aftermath. Up till now, that was I believe, the most consequential decision that an American president had made since, I don't know when. And we're still paying the price for that decision. So you continue covering the costs.
Yeah, I meant more like the sourcing.
Our sources, we're going back to some of the same sources today.
But more like the other people, I guess, like the higher-ups and who were
they're all gone.
Implicit in that.
Well, they're gone. I mean, they're all political appointees. They've moved on for the most part.
I meant like 05, 06, in that realm. Does that complicate your reporting at all?
Not really.
No.
We just sort of kept doing what we were doing. I mean, we would try to talk to these people or get their opinion or their comment, but that wasn't sort of
right.
Our focus was where it was.
But a lot of them actually did leave after 04, when he ran for his second term. A lot of them did take off. Vice President Cheney did, but Rummy did eventually, and so did Wolfowitz, and so did George Tenet. And I mean, a lot of them just left. We stayed, and we're still here, and still doing what we're supposed to do as journalists, which is to hold our government accountable, checks and balances, et cetera, et cetera. But we're still, even today, still writing about and covering the dire consequences of the decision to invade Iraq. We have, just look at what's going on in the Middle East today. All of that, not all of it, let me back up. The emergence of Islamic State, the metastasizing of Al-Qaeda from the tribal areas of Pakistan across the region as far as North Africa. I mean, that's all, and the costs we're paying, the economic costs we're paying still today, the costs in suicides by service members who have gone on multiple tours to Iraq. We're back in Iraq. We have hundreds of troops in Syria, which most people don't even realize, and we're about to send more troops back to Afghanistan. So we're just continuing to cover that story.
Let me just finish with one injunction to you. Never lose sight of the human element of these stories. These are stories about young men and women. I had coffee with a friend of mine who dates back to those days yesterday. And a young woman who I've known for years who was serving, this was at her father's coffee place, I asked her how her husband was. And she said, well, we're divorced. I said, God, I asked that question. She said he's had 9 deployments. And he's not himself anymore. He's suffering from post-traumatic stress. And he can't deal with the reality of life without guns going off and people trying to kill him. That's the price that's being paid at a human level. And part of your job is not just all this policy stuff that's up at this altitude. It's bringing home to people who don't understand the subject, whether it's medical or military, what the cost is to human beings, whether they're Iraqi, American, whatever, people trying to flee this growth of terrorism, trying to flee poverty. That all your readers can relate to. They may not know what Article 5 is, but they're learning what post-traumatic stress is. And don't ever lose sight of that element, because that connection between reporters and real people, your readers, your viewers, is what's going to sustain this business and get us through this very difficult period.